Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. This is Olivia Wilkinson from the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. You are very welcome to our webinar this morning on applied academic research on the topic of faith and climate. We'll be hearing from our speakers and we'll be going through the presentations from 3 speakers and then having time for question and answers at the end. As you can see from the slide here, I'm the Director of Research at the JLI. We have convened this series of webinars on faith and climate since the beginning of April. So we've had one in April, May, and then this is the 3rd in June, and our 4th is in July. The first one in April was on faith-based practical examples of working around climate in implementation of programs. The second one was on interfaith initiatives, and this third one, as you can see from today, is academic or specifically applied academic research. For now, we're going to ask everyone to have their microphones muted, and before going through the speakers, I'm just going to hand over to Stacey Nam, our Senior Knowledge Manager at the JLI, to explain a little bit more about the technical elements of this Zoom platform for the rest of the webinar. Stacey, over to you.
Thanks, Olivia. So just so you know, this webinar is being recorded as well as live streamed to YouTube. So if you don't want to be recorded, if you just want to keep your microphone off, we'll be sharing the webinar recording on the JLI as soon as we can after the webinar ends. So just a couple pointers about Zoom. If you move your mouse in the Zoom screen, you'll find a menu will show up and you'll be able to have a few options. One of them is kind of a chat bubble. You can use that at any point in time to chat with everyone or with specific attendees. So if you have any technological questions at any point, you can feel free to message me. Or during the speakers' presentations, you can also put your questions in the chat box. If you can't hear any of the speakers, please also feel free to raise your hand or use any of the other buttons to let us know. And thanks for joining. And if you want to also introduce yourselves in the chat box right now, please feel free to do so. And over to you, Olivia.
Yes, it would be absolutely great if you could just introduce yourself in the chat, your name and organization, and we can get to know who's on the line today. Otherwise, as you can see, we've got a great list of speakers here. Professor Evan Berry from American University, Ulil Amri from University of Washington, and Vanessa Pizer from Episcopal Relief and Development. We don't currently have Ulil, and so we will be going to Vanessa second, unless we don't exactly know what's happening, but unless we can get through to him, we will go in the opposite order, slightly turned around at the end there for the order of speakers now. So we will hear from our speakers just a little bit over 10 minutes each, and then we will have time for question and answers. So please put your questions in the chat box and we'll be able to bring those up at the end. And so first of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Evan Berry. If we can go to the next slide. Professor Evan Berry is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Programs in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at American University. So over to you, Evan, and we will start the presentations now. Thanks.
Thank you, Olivia and Stacey, for opening the conversation, and I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you today. So I wanted to begin a little bit by talking about the background of my research so that the folks on the call can have a sense of where I'm coming from and sort of the range of what it is that I've been engaged in for the last several years, and also the limits of what my knowledge might be. So if we can move to the next slide. Over the last 5 years, I've worked on 2 different grant projects, both of which were big collaborative projects that brought scholars in from all over the world to report out on their research as it pertained to questions about the intersection between religious actors, theological ideas, and environmental politics. The first of these projects focused specifically on environmental justice and environmental rights in the Latin American region. And in that project, we produced this book that you see on the slide called Church, Cosmovision, and the Environment. And some of the cases that might come up today are drawn from my collaborators in that project. My own contribution to that work was was to engage with the faith-based organizations who are active in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so I spent several years interviewing participants or FBO accredited individuals in UN climate meetings. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's someone on this call that I've spoken with in that context over the last couple of years. So some of my work is at that global scale, but then over the last 2.5 years, my same colleagues and I from American University have been working on the project you see on the left, which is called Religion and Climate Change in Cross-Regional Perspective. And in that project, we brought together researchers from a variety of fields, political scientists, anthropologists, scholars of religion, all of whom are interested in questions about climate change and environmental crisis and how those are being met, mostly at the local and national level by religious actors and religious ideas. And I want to drill down into some of our findings in our conversation today. So if we can move to the next slide. I wanted to sort of begin by thinking about what it is that academic knowledge provides for folks who are working in the nonprofit sector, and especially what kinds of findings might be useful to people from NGOs, from religious environmental organizations, and from faith-based humanitarian organizations. And one of the things I think is important is that academic research often works on a macro level. Many people who are doing humanitarian or development work have very project-specific views about what it is that they're doing. They know their sites very well. They know their countries very well. They know their traditions very well. They know their institutions very well. But they're not paid to stop and be able to step back and think about connections and resonances and ways that the kinds of issues they're concerned about vary across regions or across traditions. And so these macro level questions, big picture questions, I think are things where academic knowledge might be of use. So I want to pose a couple of those big picture questions and sort of have those in the background for the remainder of my remarks. The first of them is religious engagement with climate change expanding? Is this a growing movement? And if so, what can we say about it? So one thing that my research and research from other scholars corroborates is that there is a growing number of non-governmental organizations, religious environmental organizations, and faith-based organizations who are active around climate change, both at the level of the United Nations and in terms of local level efforts to address adaptation and mitigation efforts. It's also the case that academic research demonstrates that there's more media attention to the role of religion in thinking, in talking about climate change and public discussions of climate change. Obvious examples are around the Pope's encyclical from a couple of years ago. But in addition to that, there's simply much more opportunities for faith-based organizations to make their efforts publicly heard in partnership with journalists and media sources. And then finally, I would want to mention that there is quite a bit of polling and survey data about the relationship between mostly religious belief and climate change. And that data indicates an ambiguous picture. Perhaps worldwide, there is some important relationship with the way communities of faith think about climate change, but maybe in Anglophone societies, especially in the United Kingdom and in North America and Australia, there are some uneven ways in which religious commitment is related to concern about climate change. And we can discuss that more in the Q&A, but it would at least the empirical research on this question might ask whether or not there is a clear upward trend of improvement in the overall space. And then finally, I think this is the question that will be most relevant for participants in this webinar. Is religious engagement with climate change effective? And if so, where and why? And rather than to think about this as a big picture question, I'd like to present a couple of cases that are drawn from the research my collaborators have been doing the last couple of years and talk us through those. So if we can move to the next slide. My colleague David Haberman, who's a researcher at Indiana University, who focuses on Hinduism and the environment, has been doing a series of ethnographic interviews in northern India in a town called Gangotri and in the surrounding valley. This is a pilgrimage site, and the thing that's really interesting about his work is that he focuses on changing stories around climate change. He's been traveling to this region for nearly 30 years, and in the last 10 to 15 years, he's noted a shift in the way that the local community thinks about climate change. They accept the scientific description of climate change and its sources, but also want to raise the importance of local causes, not just global greenhouse gas emissions. They're concerned in particular about the relationship between local development practices and climate change. He's spoken to many people who assert the linkage between increasing tourism, tourism development, the number of pilgrims coming through the valley, and that those overall trends of travel, transportation, hotels, infrastructure are also, they see those things as being part of the causes of climate change. And the part of this that I want to bring forward for our conversation today is that it's really important to acknowledge how local communities understand climate change and to think about the relationships between their understandings and the discourses about climate change that operate at the international political level. And there's a difference there that I think the work of non-governmental organizations is sensitive in addressing, and we can talk a little bit about what that might mean in a moment. I also wanted to talk about a case drawn from Fiji. This is a case based on a village that was part of a planned relocation project where the government was hoping to resettle a village further inland on the other side of a mountain valley, and the local community was frustrated about the government's plan, and a variety of religious actors, both from the Methodist Church and also from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, played a role in helping broker the interests of between the government and the community. This is by my colleague Amanda Bertana, who's now at the University of Maine, and her findings suggest another important dimension, which is that oftentimes religious groups have an important role in terms of trust, that they play a special role in helping get buy-in from communities and also have access to either regional or national level climate adaptation planners. The third case that I wanted to present comes from the island of Tobago, which is part of Trinidad and Tobago. My colleague Roger Mark D'Souza, who's now the executive director of Sister Cities International, conducted this research a couple of years ago, and he was focused on local participation in coral reef management plans. So here, the question of religion and the question of religious groups is an interesting one. It was actually out of a local prayer group that the opportunity for youth in a particular town on the east side of Tobago found out that they were able to participate in the coral reef management planning, and that their findings from a community-based research project would be reported up as part of Trinidad and Tobago's climate adaptation planning, and that it specifically was a good opportunity for them to think about how to manage tourism without discouraging the local economy, but in ways that were sensitive to local concerns about sacred places, about local concerns about stewardship, and that this is another role that religion has to play, which is that it's part of local level discourses about what kinds of solutions they envision for themselves. So if we can go to the next slide, I have a few sort of conclusions that I hope we can, and recommendations that we can draw from this. The first is that faith-based groups play an important role in translating scientific information into political and ethical concepts that matter at the local level. One of the things that our project consistently found across regions, across nations and cultural contexts is that often the way that international level policymakers think about why climate change is a problem is abstracted from the kinds of concerns that local communities have. And that in this sense, faith-based organizations and religiously affiliated organizations have some special capacity to play a role as a translator or broker of knowledge, that they can both inform policymakers and the scientific community about what kinds of concerns matter to local communities, and they can also help translate the language of science and policy into local level conversations. The second major finding of our research is that faith-based groups are well positioned to facilitate appropriate adaptation projects. And this is, I think, sort of taking a step further than merely translating information and helping communities design projects that are tailored to those kinds of needs and interests and moral considerations. So adaptation projects should work within religious and moral frameworks. They should be based on local needs and interests rather than what national level policymakers prescribe for local communities. Religious organizations and faith-based groups are, I think, well positioned to help advance community-based project design and also to get buy-in from local stakeholders. This is something that I think many of you would be familiar with, but religious organizations are often the groups that have been in a community for a very long time and have earned over those long relationships trust from local leaders. And I think that that trust is a really important source for why faith-based engagements with climate change have continued to expand in recent years, because they're able to get folks to sit down at the table and to talk about what those local solutions might look like without, in a way that's a little different from national policymakers or from folks who are coming in from organizations that don't have an on-the-ground presence to begin with. So I'm happy to continue to discuss this further in the Q&A, but for now, I think that's good. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Evan. And so we will have time for questions in the Q&A. So please, just a reminder that you can put your questions into the chat. I'd also still encourage anyone who's new or hasn't done so yet to put your name and organization in the chat so we can see who's on the call as well. Thank you very much. So thankfully, Ulil has had some technical problems, but we hope that he's here with us now. So Ulil, if you can unmute, that would be great. So Ulil Amri is at the University of Washington. Originally from Indonesia, his research is also focused on that country. And we will be hearing about his PhD research, which he just recently completed. Ulil, over to you.
Hi, can you guys hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you so much, Olivia, for organizing this for us. I'm really happy to share my research project that I've been working on this since 2009, actually. So what I would like to present today is part of my research project. So I have, since I started my PhD, I am doing more theoretical kind of work on how to see or understand the relationship between religion, environment, and economy in Indonesia. And today's presentation is more like the, applied part of my PhD project. As you see from the title of my presentation, it is about Pesantren's religious environmentalism and renewable energy project in Indonesia. Can we move on to the next? Good, thank you. A little bit about Pesantren's background. Pesantren is an Islamic educational institution in Indonesia, and it used to be a pure educational institution, but today it has transformed itself to be more like economic oriented institution, and more importantly, it is more environmentally friendly organizations that has done many things from combating deforestation, conducting reforestation, and finding alternative energy source. So next slide, please. In Indonesia, there are about 30,000 pesantrens, and there are some pesantren that have been focusing on specific environmental works. And when I started my research, I did interview and observe the involvement of some pesantrens, mainly in Java. And when I studied my PhD, I focused on one particular pesantren that has conducted some type of environmental action or practices, ranging from tree plantings, greening the environment, and especially producing alternative energy. So the picture that you all are seeing right now is one action that has been promoted by pesantren in East Java province. The name of the pesantren is Pesantren SUNAN DRAJAT. They initiated, I mean, the members of the pesantren have initiated a KEMIRI SUNAN or CANDLENUT or biodiesel project, collaborated with Agrindo, a private company, and also a research institute called 10 November Institute of Technology. It is like MIT or Caltech here in the United States, and they have developed a CANDLENUT tree to become like biodiesel since 2006, and they are quite proud of this project because this is the first time or the first initiative in Indonesia. And you can see there are about hundreds of trees have been planted inside of the pesantren, where students or the followers or the members of the pesantren are enjoying, you know, the trees during their leisure time. Next page, please. This is basically what they are doing right now. They try to separate the kernel from the shell, and then they extract the kernel, and then they got the crude oil. So what I was told by my interlocutors or the members of the pesantren was that actually the crude oil was quite good enough to power a diesel engine. But if they do, you know, a kind of trans-esterification process, it is what they told me, the quality of the oil or the CANDLENUT oil will be much better. So now they are still developing the, you know, kind of laboratory process to produce better or more efficient biodiesel product. And they are still trying to planting more trees in order to increase the number of the supply of the product in order to lower the cost of production. And so far they have planted hundreds or even millions of candlenut trees all over Indonesia, not only in Java, but also Sumatra, Kalimantan, and Nusa Tenggara, perhaps Sulawesi as well. And next slide, please. And these are some of the thoughts and recommendations that I have or would like to mention here. The emergence of these socio-environmental project, if you will, emerge from or have been driven by various forces, global, national, and local forces, such as global demand on alternative energy or global action on combating climate change, and national search for alternative energy source that have been massive actions in Indonesia right now. And especially this is the most important part that I have found during my field work since 2009 till 2017 was that local forces like the search of the economic benefit have also inspired the emergence of religious environmentalism in Indonesia, such as the production of alternative energy. And in turn, this kind of environmental practice creates multiple subjectivities. Some of my interlocutors are doing this action for altruistic, idealistic kind of vision to protect the environment, to save the future, so on and so forth. But at the same time, they are also looking for kind of economic benefit in addition to doing more idealistic work to protect or save the environment. And this is my point that I would like to propose, that so the future work, especially from us in academia and also policymakers, if we would like to see more engagement with local faith institutions such as Pesantren, and based on my research in Indonesia, we should see the intertwinement or entanglement between ecology and economy, and they will be very what I would like to say, they will be very interested in joining this kind of socio-environmental action when they see a kind of economic benefit in it. So yeah, this is all about the story that I would like to mention. I'm an anthropologist, so I'm gonna stop there, and question and answer will be wonderful later if you guys have some questions about this project. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ulil. Yeah, it's great to have the in-depth knowledge of the Pesantren and how that operates and their ecological thinking, and the connection between the ecology and the economy is perhaps something we can discuss at the end. And that was great to do a little bit of a deep dive on a specific case as well. So now we're going to be handing over to Vanessa Pizer, who's the Senior Programs Officer at Episcopal Relief and Development, who'll be talking about a research collaboration that they've undertaken. So we can see a little bit more as well about this link between research and practice in the area of climate and faith. Over to you, Vanessa.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you to Olivia, Stacy, and others at JLI for organizing this webinar series and for today's topic on applied academic research. So I'll be speaking from the perspective of a faith-based organization and the local faith organizations that we work side by side with, and then to share our experience partnering with academic researchers. I'll focus on the key learnings from the research process, as well as a bit about the actual findings of the scoping study we concluded recently. First off, though, a bit about Episcopal Relief and Development and how our partnership with Cornell University has evolved over the years. Episcopal Relief and Development is an international humanitarian agency of the Episcopal Church. We partner with local organizations, mostly the development arms of Anglican and Episcopal churches, in order to serve the most vulnerable communities. Our key areas of intervention are women, children, and climate, and these are guided by integrated frameworks on early childhood development, gender justice, and climate resilience. We also support our local partners' institutional capacity building, so as to ensure the impact and sustainability of the program work. Our climate resilience strategy is a response to cyclical and worsening disasters, mostly droughts and floods, which we're seeing throughout the world, but really severely in many of the places where we work. These are predominantly rural and remote communities already struggling with poor social and economic outcomes. Episcopal Relief and Development, we've partnered with Cornell University's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences and their Global Fellows Program since 2013. It began with summer research placements for undergraduate students with our partners in Burundi and Tanzania. So based on the students' academic interests and the program priorities of our partner organizations, the students designed research and other types of projects, which were to support our partners' work. So after about 5 years of this type of partnership, and as we at Episcopal Relief and Development were living into our new strategic plan and focus areas, we decided to see how our partnership with Cornell could evolve and really help deepen our climate resilience strategy. So with climate change making life as usual and rural development programming as usual no longer viable, we wanted to take a step back and see if how we're working with rural communities is still effective and what are new ways we can support them to thrive in the face of climate change. So Professors Terry Tucker and Peter Hobbs, you can see them in the photos there. They lead Cornell's Global Fellows Program, and it's with them that we dreamed up the scoping study. They're both experts in agriculture. Terry more from the socio-behavioral perspective, and Peter more of a crop and soil science kind of guy. So the scoping study was designed to look at the program activities, the broader community contexts, the various stakeholders, and organizational capacities of two of our local partners, specifically the Diocese of Matabeleland in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, and the Diocese of Central Tanganyika and Dodoma, Tanzania. So Central Tanzania and parts of Southwest Zimbabwe are increasingly impacted by drought. Both of our partners there have been working with smallholder farmers on improving yields and household income via trainings on improved agricultural techniques, specifically conservation agriculture techniques, as well as market gardening and value addition, and the integration of community savings groups. So these partners, their contexts are similar in terms of climate impacts and environmental constraints, but there's some interesting differences socioeconomically and in terms of their organizational capacities and networks. So for these reasons, my colleagues and I, we decided to focus on these two partners for the scoping study, seeing that there would be some interesting comparative findings, but also findings that we could use for our broader climate resilience strategy with other partners around the world. So the in-country research component of the scoping study, it took about 2 weeks, 1 week with each partner. We designed the research methods, all qualitative, as a team. So that would be the Cornell research team of 2 professors, but also a graduate student of theirs who was actually from Zimbabwe. 2 people from Episcopal Relief and Development, myself and my colleague Abby, who works closely with the program in Zimbabwe, and of course, several program staff from our diocesan partners. So in regards to this first slide, this idea of a focus on partnership. So that's one of the key learnings from the research, which is this importance of partnership, successful, mutually beneficial collaboration, which requires balancing each other's unique and shared interests, but also priorities and skill sets. So from the start, Episcopal Relief and Development, we prioritize that our local partner staff be part of the research design, implementation, and analysis as much as possible. So not only does the research benefit their work, it's an opportunity for their skill building, networking, and leadership development. The reputation of our local partners and the church in the community and with other organizations, and the trust they've built with communities, Anglican and other, over many years, are just huge assets, not only for the programming, but for this research. In terms of the Cornell team, it was in their interest to, of course, fulfill their consultancy deliverables, but also to explore research opportunities for future Global Fellow students. Also, as academics, working directly with local people informs their broader approach to research and really grounds it more strongly in realistic, practical design and outcomes. For Episcopal Relief and Development, our interest is in bridging the gap between research and practice. So through our different relationships, we're able to provide a platform for evidence-based programs, but also practice-informed research. Next slide. One tool we used to incite dialogue among community members and with the research team is a participatory learning tool, one of many, called the seasonal calendar. So during the research, community members developed this calendar to map out their farming practices, which is also a launching pad for debate and discussion on how rainfall has changed from one year to the next, how farmers are coping, and how they're possibly adapting their practices. So it's in this way that farmers are thinking critically about their own changing environment. So rather than receiving information on these changes or simply being asked by a researcher if rain patterns have actually changed, they themselves identify the changes. They're empowered to understand these changes through their own experiences, which we think can also give space for developing collective action. Next slide, please. And so while it might seem obvious that learning was a priority of the research, what I really want to highlight here is this idea of collaborative learning and the transfer of knowledge from community to researcher, researcher to community, from community member to community member. So one way we did this was to ask farmers who are new to the program to interview graduates of the program on their experiences, whether positive or negative. Graduates shared their challenges and ideas for the future. So this community-driven discussion was an opportunity for the research team to understand the priorities of the community and then formulate practical and relevant questions, and not those just based on their own assumptions or academic research. Next slide. So here is sort of a summary of those key points I made the past 3 slides. And so specifically for Episcopal Relief and Development, we really see our role as weaving together research and practice in a way that can elevate both. Next slide, please. So with the 1 or 2 minutes I have left, I'll share a few of the recommendations from the scoping study report. The first being to continue to foster a culture of learning and critical assessment of impact, so as to ensure we're doing the right things and not just doing things right. Similar to the way in which the research was conducted, successful programs are those that are community-driven, and community interest and confidence in a project should always be of significant weight. We saw the importance of contextual strategizing, as a uniform process often neglects the unique resources, cultural dynamics, histories of the different communities that we work in. And complex problems, such as the impacts of climate change on rural livelihoods, they're really beyond the scope of any single organization. Episcopal Relief and Development and our local partners, we collaborate with government agencies, research institutes, village chiefs, other NGOs. And so therefore we're well positioned to advocate for and help organize innovation platforms. So these are spaces that bring diverse expertise and resources together to learn and change, similar to this JLI Learning Hub. So an example we actually saw in Zimbabwe was a goat marketing infrastructure strategy and smallholder education, which involved a really strong partnership between public and private sector. Moving forward with the partnership with Cornell, we're now looking at a team-based research where multidisciplinary teams of master's level students, our local partners, but also local university students, local government and local research institutes together identify high priority research topics, help ensure that they can be effectively carried out, and that the research outputs inform development strategy and practice. Lastly, the scoping study reports technical recommendations. I've just abbreviated them here. I cannot go into the detail that I'd like, but based on the research, key areas of intervention for building rural communities' resilience to climate change should really be centered around youth inclusion. So this requires designing programs aligned with their hopes, their interests, which we're seeing is not really in farming, not so much in conservation farming of staple crops, but for many, it's growing cash crops and building businesses with the assets gleaned from that. Building farmers' assets through village savings groups and livestock schemes is key to absorbing the shocks due to climate change. Water is, many of you know, is the key limiting factor for increased crop yields in many places. And even access to water for household consumption is becoming more and more difficult. So identifying the ways that the community can collectively manage watersheds, harvest water, whether through drainage ditches, dams, reservoirs, but also maintain the water infrastructure that already exists is really important for resilience. Diversified income, similar to the point about livestock and building assets, it's a way to hedge risk. And so helping farmers also to link to other markets or build other skill sets can be opportunities in this regard. So in this presentation, I hope that I showed how the different sides of collaboration, whether academic researchers or international and local faith-based organizations, we can each contribute in ways that make our work as a whole more impactful. And so research and practice can both inform and empower each other. And through our relationships and collaborative process, we hope to build programs with more practical and sustained benefits. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that was brilliant, Vanessa, and great to hear more about team-based research in the future and working with local universities and students as well. I think that would be really exciting. So now we have time for some question and answers, we will be able to, we're encouraging people to put their questions onto the chat. And then I will invite you to unmute and to speak your question to the speakers that we have here. Previously, we've just done it on the chat if you've been on the discussion on these webinars before, but we actually this time like to hear people's voices a little bit more. So please put your questions into the chat. They can either be for individual speakers or for the group as a whole. Or if you don't want to put your question onto the chat, but you do have a question, if you click on participants at the bottom of the screen, you can also see a little option that says raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, I'll see that you want to ask a question, and then I'll be able to turn to you as well. So our first question we have from Jean Duff, who's the president of JLI. Jean, over to you.
Thanks, and thank you to the panelists. Really excellent presentations, very complimentary, and it was great to hear your thoughts. Thank you. So just in the context of JLI's consideration of starting a new learning hub on faith and climate, and recognizing that this is already, as you were saying, Evan, quite an active domain, wondering what your thoughts are about the research and knowledge gaps or priorities, and where you might think, based on your academic work and the research work of the panelists, where you might think it would be useful for JLI to focus its learning hub. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, so we'll go in order of the speakers. Evan, over to you first.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I actually arrived home last night from a few days at a conference focused on this very topic. The International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture held a conference on the theme religion, climate, and water. And most of the folks at that conference are sociologists and qualitative researchers sharing their work on this. And one theme that kept consistently coming up is that most of the research done to date focuses on organizations, traditions, and communities weighted to the global north. So that even where we do know about particular projects and cases that are in the global south, we almost, for the most part, most of the scholarship on this topic is about organizations headquartered in the global north. And this is one of the things that I, in particular, appreciate about Ulil's research, which is that he's, although he is a researcher located at an institution in the global north, the organization and communities he's working with are very much Indonesian based, right? So I think this is one of the places where it would be great to hear from him, and also to think a little bit more thoroughly about whether the kinds of knowledge transfers that we were hearing about in this most recent presentation are necessarily north-south transfers. And of course, there are also transfers within the community and across generations. What does it look like when we want to think about the differences between institutions and organizations in the global north versus those based in the global south?
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, this is something that we're often thinking about as well. So it's great to hear that this is not just an issue in some of the other areas that we look at, but of course some of this research as well. So over to you, Ulil, if you can unmute. Ulil, you're still on mute if you're trying to speak.
Okay, thank you for the question. And Ivan just pointed out the global south and north kind of gap or relationship, and I think it's also important to see how there are some efforts have been done by some researchers to bring more kind of aspirations or voice from the global south to the north, especially to the academia or to the policymakers and NGO activists as well. And I would like to share just a brief discussion that I had with my interlocutor when I did my fieldwork, I think last time, 2017. One of the interlocutors told me that what is the benefit of us of participating in your research, and what do you think the practical or concrete benefit for us to join this kind of discursive academic discussion and debate on the relationship between religion and environment? And I was quite surprised by those kind of questions, because it challenged me, especially anthropologists or social science researchers, to see how our thought, our discussion in academia, our debate, our study so far bring real impact for the community or people who are facing or dealing with this kind of everyday environmental issues or problem at the local level. And what I said to them is that I would love to see, more collaborative kind of project in the future. And it is good to start this kind of collaboration by, discussing, some of these problems, identifying the problems first, and then we can move forward from those kind of problems. So my commitment in the future will be bring this kind of theoretical, discursive kind of study, debate, or discussion from my dissertation to be more like, applied kind of things in the future, especially with my interlocutors in Indonesia. I'm Indonesian, so I would be very happy to work with my fellow Indonesian as well in the future. I would like to do more, for example, covering or studying other religious tradition as well in my country, and try to see how interfaith kind of discussion and works also happening in the future. So sorry if it's too long. I'm going to stop.
No, thank you very much, Ulil. Absolutely. It's a question that anyone doing field research is familiar with and often plays on our mind, about how we make it worthwhile for the research. So, okay, over to Vanessa as well, please. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Jean, for that question. I think what I could add is just more exploration as to how faith can be a motivating factor, whether for mitigating climate change or building resilience. And back to Dr. Berry's point about how faith-based organizations have this special capacity to be a broker of knowledge around climate and climate resilience. So more case studies and examples of how that's working. Also examples of how systems thinking and multidisciplinary teams that include faith-based actors are working and succeeding in whether climate change mitigation or building resilience, I think are interesting areas for a potential learning hub.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. So now we have Grove Harris. Please, Grove, if you can, then we'll over to you. We can't hear you, I'm afraid. I can see you're unmuted though. Grove, I'm afraid we can't hear you. I'm very sorry. This is why we also have the questions on the chat, fortunately. So I will ask your question on your behalf. I'm very sorry. So Grove's question is, can we put a gender lens on these findings? How are women agents in the implementation, actors in the decision-making, or unseen labor more burden on women? I think this is really interesting. Climate, it can be a cross-cutting issue in other sectors, but we also have our other cross-cutting areas such as age and gender that we have to think about, and perhaps the different marginalizations that people experience, the different vulnerabilities that people experience in their life. And so how do we put some of these cross-cutting issues, and specifically gender, as Grove asks, onto these topics, and analyze these topics through those lenses as well. I'll go in the same order. So this is a question for the group. And Jean has also just reminded me on the chat there as we come to the end of the conversation. If you have any resources that you'd like to share, please put them, please put a link on the chat. So over to the group about gender and age.
Yeah, that's a great question, Grove, and I appreciate you bringing it to the foreground. One of the issues that I consistently see in academic research on this topic is the attention that's paid to religious officials and their role in helping move forward debates about climate change. And of course, that's something we hear often at the global level when we think about Laudato Si or His Holiness Patriarch Bartholomew I. But those same kinds of conversations get replicated at the local scale, right? The role of religious leadership and that's a way of thinking about how religion is engaged with climate change that often marginalizes the conversations that are happening closer to the ground, which are conversations that are less about the vested interests of the mostly male leadership of religious traditions, and not as much about the needs and interests of communities, which are often comprised of women and youth, because in communities that have been already impacted by climate change, many times the men have had to migrate to do research. So one of the cases in our network was about a community in northern India where most of the men in a village have migrated to cities either for labor or have joined the army as a way of providing an income. And so all of the farming activity is now being done by women and children. And so this is particularly problematic because a lot of the knowledge about farming practices had been carried through generations where gender equity was part of the local landscape. And so that specific dimension, this question about the ways in which other gender issues intersect with climate change, labor migration, sort of the gender division of labor, those kinds of questions are ones that have to be addressed in program development in this space. And that's just one example, but if we wanted to stop, we could think of countless others. So something clearly that we need to keep at the forefront of this conversation.
Thanks, Evan. Ulil? You're still on mute if you're trying to speak, Ulil.
Okay. I agree with Evan that gender issue is one of the most important issues and interesting issues that need to be addressed for future work on religion and ecology, or religion and climate change. And this is the limitation of my project. I should admit that I haven't really covered the involvement of women in participating in this climate kind of action indirectly. I saw, or I observed their participation more on the economic kind of activities, but I haven't really tried to push myself to see their involvement in this specific environmental action or practices. I did so, and when I interviewed my interlocutors, so they have been involved in, some actions like tree plantings, and also one of the most influential figures in this alternative energy project is actually a female. So yeah, I would like to dig more or delve into their involvement.
Thanks, Vanessa. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Vanessa.
Okay, thanks, Scro, for that question. And what I could provide was just anecdotal support to that. I mean, in Zimbabwe and Tanzania, most of the people you see in the fields and in the pews are older women or very young children, males, and then youth from between 15 and 30 have often left the rural areas. So we see women being really, especially older women, really being affected by the drought and the other climate impacts. And traditionally, it is the women who are growing the staple crops. We've seen that in Zimbabwe and Tanzania, where they're growing the staple crops for household nutrition, income generation. And so any programming or strategy to really build the resilience of households to climate change will have to take into consideration women and girls' unique perspectives, but the impacts of climate on them. But yeah, I think this is an area for definitely further research amongst us.
Thank you, everyone. So we've come to the top of the hour now. I think that we have potentially more questions for our speakers. And if the speakers are willing to share a link to their website or even their email address on the chat for anyone that wants to follow up with them, I'd encourage you to do so now. We have our next and final webinar in this series on the 23rd of July at the same time at 9 a.m. We are going to run for 15 minutes longer on that occasion, because we're going to have a discussion about what next, the next steps that we want to take in potentially forming a new faith and climate hub, and what would be a helpful space in which we can convene people on this topic. We've hosted these webinar series because we wanted to hear where the conversation was and who was interested. We've had a lot of great feedback from people and a lot of people that want to be involved in this, but we want to put this back to the rest of the group and allow ourselves a bit of discussion about where a useful space for convening lies and what we can bring to the discussions that already exist. So we encourage you to join for that final webinar in the series that is specifically focusing on advocacy work, and we'll have speakers from a lot of different organizations that do advocacy work around COP and other different global and national and local level policy work. It should be a great session at the end of July, and we look forward to seeing you then. And we have all the resources that we're gathering on this page, our website, jliflc.com/climate. So again, we encourage you, if you have any other resources that you'd like to share, to post on the link that's on that page, or you can email them to us as well. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.